feel like those high-end restaurants just are able to put the time and the money and the effort into curating these spaces as carefully as you would a gallery or an installation, from the service to the furniture. And I just love that there's that much care taken in sort of delivering an experience to people.
I often think of food as art, but what about art that is food? Elizabeth Willing is a Brisbane-based visual artist whose sculptures, installations, prints and paintings often explore food. She also presents concept dinners and collaborative performances around the dining table. Her exhibitions have been held all over the place, including Berlin, Museum in Denmark, Basel in Switzerland, and she's currently got a show at Tolarno Galleries in Melbourne. Elizabeth, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to Dirty Linen today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's really exciting to be speaking to you about your art and about the way it relates to food. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a visual artist. I work across a lot of different mediums, as your introduction kind of explained, but you could say it's primarily sculpture and performance. I've been working with food as a material for around 13, 14 years, pretty much since I started making art at university. And I tend to use food materials as in my sculptures and installations, but I also do a lot of research into food and use the ideas around food as material as well. So the practice, although it seems pretty specific to be focusing just on food, it's extremely broad as well in its approaches to that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like food it's sort of endless, and that's why I love writing about it, talking about it, engaging with it in all different ways. I feel like it's such a starting point for conversations and thoughts about all kinds of things. I mean, does that resonate with you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started using food as a material, it was because I enjoyed making food, eating food as well. I also kind of grew up with some interesting relationships to food in my family and things, but it never really seemed that important. But the more I started using food in public spaces and galleries and kind of opening up the work to interaction and participation, the more I found that stories were really important when, connected to food, and the more research I did into it, absolutely the kind of themes that I started working with exploded because it's just so fascinating and so diverse. So definitely my personal interests have driven it from the beginning, but seeing how diverse the different stories are, and in that field, and as well how diverse the kind of people are that telling the stories has continued to drive the work and push it in different directions.
So I think you need to give us some examples of the kind of work that you do. Obviously, we should all be like seeing it, or we should be at one of your events. But in the meantime, can you just describe some of the approaches that you've taken and some of the exhibitions or installations that you've been part of? Yeah,
sure. I mean, I do agree seeing it in the flesh is the best because it is a really multisensory sort of practice. So even though I can explain what it might look like, it's impossible almost to explain the smells of experiencing these kind of works. But for example, a work that I've done a couple of times is using pfeffernuss biscuits, which are those sort of dome-shaped gingerbread cookies that you might eat at Christmas, and they have like a thin white crust of icing on them. And I glue those to the gallery wall in a grid pattern with royal icing, so the whole work is kind of edible. And throughout the course of the exhibition, people can bite the biscuits off the wall and reveal the kind of brown, beautifully smelling, spicy gingerbread underneath. And so the kind of pattern of consumption and people's interaction with the work is revealed in the sort of traces of people's biting or eating. Whereas a work that I have on at Tolarno, for example, in the current show, uses those sort of horrendous sherbet tubes. They're like see-through plastic tubes filled with coloured sherbet, like coloured sands. And I get 1,000 or so of those and chop the ends off and join them end to end just by kind of squishing and crushing the end and poking them into the next one to create one continuous looping tube, like a big kind of racetrack around the gallery. And in that process, the sherbet spills out onto the floor and leaves traces and spills of quite bright, colourful sherbet markings as well. So that piece isn't necessarily edible, but it's very multi-sensory kind of work nevertheless. So those are a few examples of the sculptural food-based material works. But as you said, I also create dining performances, which take as their starting point fine dining experiences, but then introduce a really sculptural elements into them, where I'm reworking, new sort of ceramic plates, or redesigning the glass cup, or creating scented cutlery, something like that. And I also do printing and video. It's endless. I follow my ideas, so it can come in any form.
I just have to ask about scented cutlery.
Yeah, I was very fortunate a few years ago to go and work with the Experimental Food Society in London, and I worked with a scientist called Charles Spence over at Oxford, and he introduced me. His whole area of study was around cross-modal processing. So the way that our senses come together to influence flavour. So what we're seeing and how that influences our flavour, the flavour of the food, what we're hearing, what we're feeling. And that idea and the research that he's done and that people have done around the world around this idea just kind of blew my mind. And I wanted to take a lot of these ideas and start to integrate these sort of formal qualities and olfactory qualities and auditory qualities into sculptures that you could interact with at the table. So the scented cutlery, originally I made them out of porcelain and just didn't glaze them, so I could sort of dunk them into scents or, essences and things. So as you're eating off this cutlery, the smell is wafting around your face, and you're kind of maybe tasting something, but smelling something else, and that kind of comes together to form an entirely new flavour that's maybe surprising or a bit confusing. I also made the scented cutlery out of timber, which absorbs smell very well too. And the beauty of these materials is also that as you're handling them, the warmth of your hand, activates the smell a little bit more, warms it up and releases it even more so.
Wow. I just have about 50,000 questions, so I'm not sure where to go. But maybe let's just go back a little bit. You mentioned that when you were growing up, there were interesting relationships with food. Like, what are you talking about there?
I won't go into the specifics because I think it'll take some more time to really fully understand, like everyone trying to figure out their families, But I think that, I got this sense that the eating and psychology were deeply entwined. That's something that I've only just kind of started to understand or reflect on properly in the last decade or so. But so there was some sort of, complex relationships in that way in a psychological sense, but also some severe sort of allergies as well that we were dealing with in the family. And then from my perspective, I kind of expressed my ethics through eating. So I was a vegetarian for most of my teens and 20s as well. So, I don't have those kind of relationships with food that are kind of warm and nourishing and deeply entrenched in culture in that really classical sense, I have a bit more of a maybe complex or fractured relationship to food, and I don't know, maybe the work is kind of one way to figure that out, but I also just think that maybe my upbringing is like a wonderful fertile platform for trying to reimagine food as well. When you lack strong roots, or you kind of, keep jumping around a bit with food, then it's like starting fresh every time. So there's positives and negatives to that, but it's kind of the context of my food education.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And the works that you're exhibiting at the moment at Tolarno, they're also really tied up in fermentation and yeasts, and then there's also potatoes involved. So can you tell us a bit more about all that?
Yeah, and I think to kind of return to the idea that I was just talking about, mental health is also a really strong theme in those works. So I'm often kind of thinking about the way that self-medication was sort of demonstrated to me growing up. So the things that we ingest to kind of make ourselves feel better, so alcohol, plant-based sedatives or drugs and those sorts of things, those sort of themes definitely come through in the work through the representation of motifs such as like marijuana or St. John's wort or valerian. But also, as you said, yeasts are like a really common thread and something that I've been working through more prominently since I did a residency with the Australian Wine Research Institute, supported by ANAT down in Adelaide. And my time at the Wine Research Institute opened my eyes to the massive role that, you know, yeasts play in that industry, but also knowing very well that they're like yeasts are a collaborator in producing bread and beer. And I just kind of love the idea that there's this like little organism that we have to work in collaboration with or domesticate, or they've domesticated us, or I don't know what it is. But the yeast also comes through in this Kipfler print, which I've been doing for like 10 years or so. So, I mean, I'm interested in potato printing, and it's led me to the Kipfler potato, which is that lovely wormy, you know, wriggly sort of potato, which is a bit fancier, which I kind of love, that it's a little bit posh or something when you're talking about something so silly as potato printing. And it also looks a bit like a poo or something too. So it's a bit of a contradiction in potato form.
And so how do you, like, what do you dip it in to create the prints?
Yeah, I mean, it's not much of a stretch from what a kid would do, you know, with potato printing, or what you might have experienced as a kid if you had the opportunity to do potato printing. You just chop it in half and get like a sponge roller and roll acrylic paint onto it. And it's definitely something that I've been honing. Like the way that I do it is different to, you know, how I was doing it 10 years ago. And I generally print directly onto raw linen, which has this relationship to like a tea towel or a tablecloth or something like that, as opposed to something more art material like a primed linen or something like that. So I'm trying to just keep that raw material. But yeah, I just sort of stamp the potato. Sometimes I overlap them. Sometimes I carve into the potatoes first to see what happens when I make those prints with the carvings. Yeah.
Wow, I do remember, doing potato prints myself, and also doing them with my kids when they were little. And it's really interesting. It makes me sort of think, you know, what other of those, you know, kindergarten art techniques do we shrug off when actually we could, you know, return to them. I guess even with the sherbets, it's like even the mess that you can make with food, and you know, kids do make mess and sometimes take joy in making mess. And you know, I suppose we're trained to become neater. I think it's really interesting to think about, you know, where messiness can take us in terms of, I don't know, how we relate to food.
Yeah, it is something I've been thinking about. In particular, the way that mess can reveal the sort of performance of making, you know, like the way that when you're making pancakes in the morning, the flour left on the floor and on the counter is kind of the traces of that performance in the morning or something. And that's a little bit how I think about this like sherbet that's sprayed across the floor or that spills out of the tube in this like wiggly way. I'm definitely interested in performing, but also things that tell the story of performance, because a lot of the time it can be quite difficult as a visual artist to kind of capture a performance outside of like videoing it or photographing it, you know. But if you can try and capture that in an installation or a sculpture, that's really exciting to me.
So I know that gender politics in food is something that you've also engaged with. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. I mean, there's some really sometimes I look at it from two perspectives. There's like the home kitchen, the domestic kitchen, which traditionally not less and less these days, but is sort of dominated by the female. And that's kind of a narrative that's been pushed down through my family, where my nana was it was kind of the only way that she knew how to show love, actually, is through food. And so there's kind of this, matriarchal dominance of the kitchen. And then you've got the kind of high-end kitchen, which is typically, again, I was talking in stereotypes here, dominated by the male chef. And that's a space where it's not so much about love and caring and knowing who your audience is. That's more a place where it's like creativity and the labor is expressed more towards entertaining or something like that. So these two kitchens, both really, the kitchen of the mother and the kitchen of the high-end chef, really appeal to me as spaces of making, because they express food in such different ways and such different outcomes come from them. So I love home cooking and baking. I'm definitely like a novice at it, but I also completely love going to like really high-end restaurants and experiencing that as art. And so I take sort of narratives from both of those kitchens, but it is important that I'm looking at it and at these stories from a female perspective, you could say. And a lot of the forms and motifs and performances that I create definitely draw from feminist dialogues, you could say.
I mean, it's so interesting, in those, I guess, stereotypical, but actually also very existent male-dominated kitchens. Those chefs so often refer to the mother or the grandmother or the sainted aunt, and those dishes that hooked them onto food or taught them about flavour, and then but their renditions of them all have this quote unquote elevated angle to them, where it's like, yes, that was the food that nurtured and nourished me, but it somehow isn't good enough for this scenario. Like there has to be this it has to be changed and developed, and there has to be this, like, I don't know, this male gaze applied to it, or there has to be mastered in some way. So I think those things are so interesting to think about.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That's a really interesting way of looking at the way that chefs interpret that mother kitchen. Yeah,
it's I mean, you love those grandmother stories, but then it's also like, well, where's the grandmother? Why do we need to have this dish all kind of squared off and highly quote unquote refined? Like, I don't know. Yeah. I love that food too, and I love those experiences. And it's not just men doing it, and but it is it is very much I think a male dominated space, and it is it is really interesting. What you mentioned, you've worked with chefs, you've been at the Wine Institute. Like, what kinds of responses do you get from people that are already in the food and wine world from this perspective and interest that you bring to it?
There hasn't been a lot of crossover into the food world. I have tried many times and just hit dead ends, to be honest. I think that people are just really busy. Everyone is just trying to survive. That's the impression that I'm getting. And that, I don't know, there's already a lot of collaborations and stuff going on within the industry. I'm not sure that people necessarily... Yeah, I don't really know. I have worked with several chefs, and it's been really amazing, really rewarding experience. From their perspective, I think that they've enjoyed it, but it's also really hard. These sort of performances that I do take at least 6 months, ideally 12 months to put together, and that's just a long time, in the restaurant world, I think. To kind of be collaborating on something. So in some ways I haven't had as many opportunities as I'd like to kind of integrate into that world.
That's so interesting. I mean, would you like to? Like, do you have like a dream collaboration?
Yeah, I'd love to work at many different restaurants, but Alinea over in America would be my dream with Grant Achatz. I think that's the pronunciation. That's where sort of it really starts to become art for me. And I haven't visited that restaurant, but just viewing it from the outside, I have had chances to kind of do a lot of food tourism, and I feel like those high-end restaurants just are able to put the time and the money and the effort into curating these spaces as carefully as you would a gallery or an installation, from the service to the furniture, and I just love that there's that much care taken in sort of delivering an experience to people. And so that would be a space that I'd really love to work in. But I'd also love to just design my own restaurant as well from the ground up.
Yeah. Well, I think I was like, when Grant Achatz came to Australia once, he demonstrated his edible like helium balloon at a demo that I went to, and it was pretty extraordinary. Like, he told the whole story of how they developed the material that could be inflated, and then there it was kind of floating around. Yeah. It's I don't know, like, it is really amazing to, I guess, just push the boundaries of what dining can be. But there is also this element of, it's not eating really. Like, it's food. Yeah, it's food as art, but is it a meal? I don't know. I feel like it's so interesting to think about those things. But yeah, I totally hear you, the resources, to have a dedicated development kitchen and a whole brace of development chefs. I think even to close for some months of the year just to, work on new things, that would be pretty fun. And I guess more is in that sort of, conception and development and the final realization that is more in that art world, I guess, timeline, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I often think of El Bulli, that was, and their model as being this kind of beautiful sort of, demonstration of that. It's so unrealistic, and there's just a certain amount, I think, that people will pay for a meal. And I guess that's the other thing about the food and the art world, and where sometimes there's that disconnect, there's sort of like maybe a price ceiling on a meal because it's performative, but it's ephemeral, and you can't really take anything away from it apart from the memories. Whereas when you sell something like an artwork, you expect to be able to kind of hold on to that, or at least some people would. So there's, especially in Australia, I think there's an even lower sort of price ceiling for those sorts of things. So it's just interesting to think about how there's only so much that can go on. There's almost like a limit that chefs can put in because they can't just keep investing time and money in something that people won't buy. Yeah,
but I think there is an appetite for things that happen in the moment and for performance art. And I mean, concerts, like rock concerts, can be expensive. So I'm not sure why performance art can't be. But yeah, I mean, hopefully, just a slight segue, but hopefully now that we've got an actual minister for the arts and a prime minister that actually seems to go to the theatre, then maybe there'll be a little bit more investment in those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of outcomes that you're looking for? Like, is there anywhere that you're trying to get to with these explorations?
That's a great question. I think I've ever been asked that. I really love making sculpture, and I'd love to be able to make really ambitious sculpture, even in the realm of public art. Public art is kind of an interesting space because the gallery kind of deters people from interaction, whereas public art is almost like a playground. So there's sort of some interesting tensions, even though public art can also be relatively restricted. There's something in that I kind of want to explore. It appeals to me to be able to work on really ambitious sculptural projects. Yeah. But other than that, I love my studio process at the moment, and I love having time. Honestly, all I want is more time to be able to make. That's one of my goals.
Yeah, it's so interesting, when you said, just about the thing about everyone that's working in food is so busy. I think that is so true. And, it's perhaps never been more true than it is now, with everyone struggling with the lack of staff. But I think it's so interesting to think about people who have in different industries have different practices, and just the different cycles and time lines and time zones that they're in. Because, kitchens are so, in many cases daily, or sometimes, twice or thrice daily. They're just turning. This turnover is so different to what most art practices would be. And it's it's really interesting to think about how those rhythms can intersect and overlap, and what can be learned, from both sides with those really quite key differences. It's really, so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that probably visual artists get, just trapped in different sorts of cycles. Like, I'd say about 80% of my time is spent on admin, answering emails and writing applications and those sorts of things. So, because that's just what you need to do, you have to drive your own work most of the time. So, for me, that's just where my time is kind of sucked up into. And, it'd be really nice to just be able to play more, essentially. But I'm sure that, I'm talking about exactly what a lot of chefs would like to do, to be able to just play and experiment.
Definitely. So do you reckon, what do you think people will get or start to think about or wonder when they come and see your latest show at Tolarno Galleries?
It's really new work. Which means that I'm pretty clumsy when it comes to talking about it or imagining what will happen when it goes out into the world. I hope that people will, invest some time in kind of, losing themselves in the patterns. In particular, the labour of the works. There's just hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of stitching involved in the pieces, in the borders and in appliquing all the pieces onto the fabric. So it's been 2 years of solid embroidery, essentially putting this body of work of linens together. So to be able to for people to be able to get lost in that and think about what labour means, either in the kitchen or what labour means in terms of hosting or hospitality, that I'd really like people to take away from it. But there's a lot of kind of motifs and symbols that have popped up in my practice over the last 10 years that are in the works, which will hopefully link people to other parts of my practice and open up conversations with some of the themes that I was talking about, like self-medication and yeasts and gender politics and also things like food politics and agriculture. These are themes that kind of swirl through the linen works. And then the floor piece is really bright and colourful and will tie in well with the linens, I hope. And it's a really colourful, bright show, and it's and that's amplified by the really strong smelling sherbet in the room as well. So I don't really know. I think that time will tell in terms of people's response to the work. I've really enjoyed making it and really grateful for the support of Tolarno to show it. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we'll put a link in the show notes to the gallery where you can see the works, but it's definitely going to be better to see it in the flesh, in the yeast and in the potato and in the linen and in all that stitching. Congratulations on all the conceiving of such a show and all the work that's gone into putting it together. And I've loved this conversation. It's so interesting. Yeah, there's endless ways of thinking about food and engaging with it. And I'm really grateful to you for bringing us a whole bunch of new stuff to think about today, Elizabeth. Really fantastic to have you on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on to talk about the work and engaging me in some topics that I haven't had a chance to talk about in a while. Someone who's really interested in food. So thank you.
Pleasure.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.